Imagine this, it's 1917. Europe is burning in the flames of World War I. Millions are dead, empires are collapsing, and America, a young, wealthy nation across the ocean, watches from afar. For years, the United States stayed out of the chaos. President Woodrow Wilson even campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But then, almost overnight, everything changed. America declared war on Germany. The question that still echoes through history is, why? Was it about defending democracy or defending dollars? Behind the patriotic speeches and newspaper headlines, something much larger was at play: money. By 1917, powerful Wall Street bankers like J.P. Morgan and Co. had lent billions of dollars to Britain and France to finance their war efforts. If the Allies lost the war, those loans would never be repaid, and the U.S. banking system could face a financial disaster. In simple words, if Britain fell, America's bankers would fall too. Documents from that time reveal that Morgan's firm acted as the exclusive purchasing agent for the Allies and the U.S., buying everything from steel to food. It wasn't just business, it was an empire of profit built on war. So, when President Wilson finally told Congress that America must join the fight to make the world safe for democracy, some wondered, was he really protecting democracy or protecting Wall Street? In this series, we'll go deep into the hidden financial motives behind America's entry into World War I, the secret ties between the government, the bankers, and the profits of war. Because sometimes history isn't written by soldiers, it's written by those who financed them. Before the first American soldier even set foot on European soil, Wall Street was already deeply entangled in the war. From 1914 to 1917, the United States claimed to be neutral, but its money wasn't. The British and French governments were spending at an unimaginable rate, buying weapons, food, steel, and supplies to keep their war machines running. And guess who handled almost all of those transactions? J.P. Morgan and Company. In 1915, Morgan signed a secret agreement with the British government to act as their exclusive U.S. purchasing agent, and later did the same for France. Through this deal, billions of dollars flowed through Wall Street banks. Factories across America were booming, shipyards were busy, and the economy looked unstoppable. But there was one massive problem: the Allies didn't have enough gold to keep paying. So the British and French began borrowing, and borrowing, and borrowing even more, mostly from American banks. By 1917, they owed over $2.3 billion to U.S. lenders, most of it handled by Morgan and his network of financiers. If Britain lost the war, all that money would vanish overnight. For bankers, it wasn't just about patriotism, it was about survival. Many historians now believe that financial pressure from Wall Street helped push the U.S. government toward war. Newspapers began printing horror stories of German brutality. Politicians started talking about freedom and justice. But behind the moral slogans was a powerful financial reality. The U.S. economy, from weapons manufacturers to bankers, stood to gain everything from joining the war. Even President Wilson's closest advisors were aware of the stakes. They knew that neutrality was no longer sustainable, not because of German submarines or lost lives, but because of money. So, while the public saw America entering the war to defend liberty, insiders on Wall Street saw something very different: an opportunity to secure their investments and reshape the global financial order. This was not just a war fought on the battlefield, it was a war fought in bank ledgers and balance sheets. When America decided to join World War I, not everyone was convinced. For 3 long years, the American public had proudly supported neutrality. Most people believed the war was Europe's problem, not theirs. So, how did the U.S. government turn a nation of pacifists into a nation of patriots, almost overnight? The answer: propaganda. In April 1917, just days after declaring war, President Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, CPI, a government agency designed to sell the war to the American people. It was headed by journalist George Creel, a master of persuasion who understood one powerful truth: people don't fight for politics, they fight for emotion. The CPI used newspapers, posters, movies, and radio to stir fear, anger, and pride. Posters showed Uncle Sam pointing directly at viewers. "I want you for the U.S. Army." Pamphlets warned of German atrocities, some real, many exaggerated. Hollywood joined the campaign, making films that painted the Germans as monsters and Americans as heroes. The message was simple: this isn't about bankers or business, it's about freedom. But behind the scenes, that same wave of patriotism created an ideal cover for massive financial mobilization. The government began issuing Liberty bonds, essentially loans from the American people to fund the war effort. And guess who managed the bond sales and marketing campaigns? Once again, Wall Street bankers, including J.P. Morgan's network. Ordinary citizens were told buying bonds was an act of patriotism, a duty to the nation. In reality, it became one of the most profitable financial operations in U.S. history. Through propaganda, the war became not just a moral mission, but a money machine, feeding both the battlefield and the banks. By the end of 1918, millions of Americans had enlisted, millions more had invested, and almost everyone believed they were fighting for democracy. Few realized they were also saving the very bankers who had financed the war from the beginning. The battle for hearts and minds had been won, not just by soldiers, but by storytellers. By 1917, the war in Europe was bleeding both sides dry. The Allies were running out of men, weapons, and, most importantly, money. For Britain and France, their survival now depended almost entirely on American financing. Behind the front lines, the US dollar had become as powerful as any army. When the United States officially entered the war, it didn't just send soldiers, it sent an economic lifeline. The U.S. Treasury began granting massive government loans to the allied nations, billions of dollars to stabilize their collapsing economies. And who helped organize these loans? The same bankers who had already invested heavily in the allied cause: J.P. Morgan, Kuhn Loeb, National City Bank, and others. This was the moment when money began to dictate military strategy. The Allies could now afford to buy American steel, food, fuel, ships, and ammunition, all on credit. Factories in the U.S. ran 24/7s, pumping out supplies for the front lines. Every bullet fired, every tank built, every ship launched carried a price tag, and that price was paid in American debt. The U.S. became the arsenal and the banker of democracy, turning the tides of war not just through force, but through finance. As the gold reserves of Europe drained away, the center of global finance shifted from London to New York. By 1918, the dollar was rising, the pound was weakening, and Wall Street was quietly building the foundations of a new world order. America's bankers had achieved something extraordinary. They had funded a victory and positioned the U.S. as the world's new financial superpower. The battlefield may have been in France, but the real turning point happened in boardrooms and bank vaults thousands of miles away. Every victory at the front came with a receipt attached. And when the war finally ended, the bill would come due, not just for Europe, but for the entire world. Because from this moment forward, war and debt would forever be linked. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, empires had collapsed, and millions of soldiers never came home. But across the Atlantic, the United States stood taller than ever, untouched, victorious, and richer than the world had ever seen. For the first time in history, America became the world's top creditor nation. Before the war, Europe had financed the world. After the war, the world owed money to America. Britain and France alone owed the U.S. over $10 billion, an amount so massive that it reshaped the global economy. And who held most of the power over this new financial empire? The same Wall Street bankers who had once feared losing their investments. The war had not destroyed them, it had made them indispensable. J.P. Morgan and Co. emerged from the conflict as an international powerhouse. Its influence now extended far beyond America's borders, into London, Paris, and even post-war Germany. The firm helped manage reparations, foreign loans, and reconstruction funds, all while earning enormous profits. Meanwhile, the US dollar began to challenge the British pound as the world's dominant currency. American gold reserves had tripled during the war, while Europe's were drained. The balance of global finance had officially shifted permanently. President Wilson's dream of making the world safe for democracy had come true in a very different way. The US now stood at the center of the new world order, but its foundation wasn't built on ideals. It was built on credit, debt, and interest. Europe's desperation had become America's opportunity, and behind every political promise of peace, bankers were quietly building the financial system that would rule the 20th century, one based on loans, repayment, and dependency. World War I may have ended the age of kings and empires, but it gave birth to a new kind of empire, an empire of money. The end of World War I wasn't truly the end. It was the beginning of a new world order, one guided not by generals or kings, but by bankers. When peace negotiations began in Paris in 1919, political leaders gathered to rebuild the world. But behind the scenes, financial power brokers quietly influenced nearly every major decision. They didn't wear military uniforms or hold public office, yet their control over money gave them invisible power. The Allied nations were drowning in debt, and their survival depended on US loans. So, when American financiers spoke, politicians listened. J.P. Morgan and Co., along with a handful of elite banking families, became unofficial architects of the post-war economy. They advised governments, set credit limits, and even shaped foreign policies. One of the most controversial outcomes of the peace talks was the Treaty of Versailles, which demanded massive reparations from Germany. These payments weren't just political punishment, they were financial strategy. Germany was forced to borrow money from American banks to pay Britain and France, who in turn used that money to repay their debts to the United States. It was a circle of debt brilliantly designed to keep American money flowing and influence growing. In effect, the war that had supposedly ended imperialism had simply replaced it with financial imperialism. While Europe tried to rebuild, Wall Street expanded its reach. New York became the new financial capital of the world. American banks opened branches in London, Paris, and Berlin, lending billions overseas. By the mid-1920s, U.S. financiers held more power over Europe's economy than many of its governments did. Even President Wilson, once an idealist, realized too late what had happened. His dream of a peaceful, democratic world had been overtaken by the reality of dollar diplomacy, where nations were controlled not by armies but by debt. The bankers who once feared financial ruin had emerged as the masters of modern economics, steering global politics from behind closed doors. And as the roaring 1920s began, the seeds of the next global crisis were already being planted, deep within the financial systems that these same bankers had created. Because when money becomes power, power eventually demands control. When the guns of World War I went silent, the world thought peace had returned. But in truth, a new kind of war had just begun, a war fought with money, credit, and debt. America had entered World War I supposedly to make the world safe for democracy. Yet, when the dust settled, what it really made safe was the American financial system, now the beating heart of the global economy. For centuries, empires conquered through armies. After 1918, they conquered through debt. The same Wall Street institutions that financed the war went on to finance nations. They lent billions to rebuild Europe, modernize industries, and stabilize currencies, all while collecting interest and securing long-term control. Loans became the new form of chains, invisible but just as strong. By the 1920s, U.S. bankers had mastered a new kind of empire, one that didn't need to occupy foreign lands because it could own their debts instead. When countries couldn't repay, they didn't lose territory, they lost sovereignty. Their policies, trade, and even political alliances became shaped by the conditions of their loans. The great irony: The same cycle of debt that made America powerful also made it vulnerable. Speculative lending and financial overreach helped trigger the Great Depression, proving that the empire built on money could also collapse under its own weight. But the lesson remained: control the debt and you control the world. In the decades that followed, this philosophy would shape global institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), born out of the same mindset that once guided Morgan and his circle. War had evolved from battlefields to boardrooms, from bullets to balance sheets. So, did America enter World War I to save its bankers? Maybe not officially, but history shows that saving the bankers ended up saving and redefining the nation itself. Because in the modern world, the most profitable product isn't oil, steel, or weapons, it's debt. And those who control it control the future.